there, I'm Yankel, and today I'm talking about bones. Now, specifically, beautiful grass-fed, grass-finished beef bones. Now, these are amazing powerhouses filled with nutrients, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna make our own bone broth out of it. Now, you can see by the bone, looking around, it's not sliced through, and that means it's packed with marrow. Now, sometimes I like to roast the bones and then extract the marrow and use the marrow for something like basting a steak or spreading on bread. Makes an incredible spread. And then I'll use the bones for stock. But today we're gonna leave the marrow in and we're gonna let all that incorporate into our very own bone broth. So I'm gonna do it in sort of the French style of stock making, which means I'm using mirepoix, which is basically a combination of carrots, onion, celery, and the ratio is always 2 parts onion, 1 part carrot, 1 part celery. Rough chop, and what we're gonna do is just mix all that up, and we're gonna roast it at an extremely high temperature in the oven to get some browning. That browning is gonna translate a ton of flavor and even a little bit of color into the broth. So these are gonna go into an oven that I've preheated to 425 for about 25 to 30 minutes or until some nice browning is happening. All right, I'm gonna put these in the oven and then we're gonna talk about how to make the broth itself. After about 30 minutes of roasting at 425, these bones and veggies smell incredible. And that means we have some nice browning happening. So, I think we're ready to go into the pot. Now that looks absolutely beautiful. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Browning on the bones. You can see they're already giving off a little bit of the marrow. It's starting to melt. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go right into my pot. And all that browning there that's happening on this pan, we're gonna actually scrape off as best we can because that is beautiful collagen that's gonna help make our bone broth even better. There is not a purer source of animal protein, I think, on the planet. Or at least one that tastes this good. Great. What I used to do in restaurants is I would put this pan back on the stovetop, heat it up, and then deglaze it all with wine for a stock, but we want a very pure bone broth, so we're just gonna scrape it off as best we can. All right, we're gonna add some fresh herbs. You can totally skip this. I just think it adds a little bit more flavor, and I happen to have some extra time. I didn't write that joke, I swear. All right. Some fresh parsley, peppercorns. One great thing to do is if you do use fresh herbs in your cooking, when you cut the stems off, you can freeze them and then use those stems every time you make some kind of broth or stock. Now, when it comes to the water amount, the key here is just to cover the bones. I don't want much more water than that. So I'm gonna go here. Water in, beautiful. And you can go pretty close to the top because we are never gonna let this come to a boil. Now that's the secret to making really good broth or stock. A low simmer, and when I say low, I mean like if you can just see bubbles breaking the surface, that's the perfect temperature. When you start to boil a stock, you start to draw impurities out of the bones, and you don't want that. We want a nice clear stock with a very pleasant, mild flavor. It's gonna taste rich, but it's gonna taste pure. And that's because we're gonna simmer it slowly. You can absolutely do this in a slow cooker on low. And one more thing, the longer you let this go, the better it's gonna be. I usually do mine at home for 24 hours, and I'll add water as needed throughout. I tend not to cover it because I want a little bit of that evaporation because it's gonna concentrate flavor. Or I'll cover it but leave a little bit open. Minimum 8 hours to really extract what you want from the bones. But the longer you leave it, the better. In restaurants, I've done it 3 or 4 days. So it really just richens and gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and more nutrients come out, and you're really getting everything you want. So we're gonna actually let that simmer for, we'll call it 8 hours, and I'll see you in a bit. Well, about 8 to 10 to 12 to 24 hours later, depending on how long you feel like leaving your broth, what we have is a little bit of evaporation, and then you can see a little bit of this foam on top. Now, one of the things you want to do when you are very lightly simmering your broth is actually scrape some of that off. Not absolutely necessary, but these are some of the impurities that escape the bones that rise to the surface. And scraping it is going to give you a more pure broth or stock. Okay, now what I'm going to do before I strain it and chill it is just pull the bones out. And that way it's just a safer straining situation than having these giant bones clanking into my strainer. So I'm just going to take the bones out, put them aside. Now I've doubled up my strainer. So I've got a fine mesh, and I've got my basic large hole colander, and then what I'm using is actually the insert for my Instant Pot. And this works really well for being able to chill down soup, stocks, or broths quickly. You can use the insert from a rice cooker. You can use any kind of pot that will basically hold everything and still leave you a little bit of room inside. And I'll show you why you want some room in the pot that you strain into. First, into our strainer. Always pour away from yourself when it's a hot liquid. Just give that a little clank, get those extra juices out of there. We have our beautiful bone broth in this container, and it's half full. You might be wondering what this prehistoric looking tool is. Well, it's actually a popsicle. And what I use it for is inserting it in the pot, because chilling this as quickly as possible is gonna make sure it lasts as long as possible. If it sits at a temperature where it's slowly cooling down, I risk bad bacteria and things that I don't want to happen. And I also don't want to put it in my fridge because it's going to raise the temperature of the fridge way too quickly. So option one is a popsicle, which of course you can make out of a water bottle. Empty the water bottle out. Or if you have a metal bottle, that works really well too. Do not use glass. But you fill it with water, freeze it, and then plunge it right into the middle. You can also fill your sink with an ice bath by plugging it, ice, water, and then settling this into that bath. So I can just put that right in there, and that's actually gonna chill it down really quickly. So I'm gonna let that chill, and then I'm gonna show you the last piece of this bone broth magic puzzle. So once my broth cooled down enough for me to refrigerate it, I refrigerate it overnight, and that allows all of that excess fat to rise to the surface, making it really easy for me to skim it off, which is what I'm gonna do. Just gently scrape that fat off the surface onto my tray. You better believe I'm gonna keep this fat. Nothing bastes a steak better than bone broth fat. And of course you can run it through a strainer one more time to get all the extra little bits off. Really depends on how much of a purist you are when it comes to these things. I have my purist days, and then I have days where I just want to leave a little fat in there because it adds some texture. And I've got my fancy bone broth jar. And you can see that will settle. It's going to be beautifully clear. That clearness is a result of the slow and low simmer. It smells really good. It's delicious cold. It's like the essence of beef as a drink. I could make a cocktail out of this, no problem. Well, when it comes to bone broth, the key is A, roasting the bones first, B, keeping it low and slow, and I mean like just a couple bubbles breaking the surface when you simmer it, and then chilling it down quickly, skimming that fat off, and there you go. You have beautiful homemade bone broth using the best bones on the planet. Absolutely amazing product. Go ahead and make some bone broth. Let me know how it turns out. Here's one more little pro tip for you. Something that I like to do to make it really easy for me to use my bone broth. Number one is I package it up once I'm done cooking in different sizes for different uses. The last thing I do is fill an ice cube tray with my broth, because then I can just pop out little cubes as I need to add flavor to a sauce, to add an element to a soup. Basically, I could throw them in a smoothie if I was feeling like I wanted a savory smoothie for the day.